Yeah, let us kick off real quick for our next session. Nice job, Dave. Good to see you. It's been a while. I'm Henrik Wagner with Lemongrass. Tim Hobbs. Paul Kirchina is a really good friend of ours. Worked with him a lot. We were here the last couple of years. And we had 40 minutes, then it became 20 minutes, and co-presenting here with NCT guys. But we have 20 minutes, and Tim Hobbs here is going to get the slides up and get going. But I wanted to say we're kind of a unique group. I'm from Stockholm, Sweden. Lived in the US for a long time with a German last name, so I get a lot of emails in German. Don't speak German. We got Jonathan Brunn up there, who's Irish but lives in Vancouver. And then Tim Hobbs here, he's from Australia and lives in Vancouver. And there's a gentleman who's our founder, who's in our booth right now doing some AI demos. Who we just showed. He's Irish, used to live in Boston, but now he's back in England. But with that, I want to just really quickly tell you that we kind of early days wrote the book on moving SAP to cloud, AWS, and then Azure and Google. But last 2 years, we pivoted very big, transform our company to work very closely with SAP and on Rise. And when we did that, we said, how can we be more relevant to our customers? We said, well, we need to invest in a kind of BTP innovation practice, which is what we're going to talk about today. We also invested in strengthening our data practice around DataSphere and now BDC and Databricks and so forth. And then we've done some really cool, unique things around Clean Core and AI, which we are demoing in our stage. But with that, I want to introduce Tim Hobbs, straight from Australia, or from Vancouver via Australia. Tim.
Thanks, Henrik. Cool. Where modern SAP meets technical governance. Let's start off with a little bit of a dive into the history of SAP. I'm not going to dwell too much on it, but just to set the scene. So we all know SAP's been around for a long time. From a technical governance point of view, when you think about Git, SAP were the people who actually invented a Git-like system when they first started off with the transportation management capability. That was well ahead of its time, but as coding languages started to evolve, they became more mature, etc., and Git actually became a real thing. SAP started to become a bit of a laggard in that space, to be 100% honest. And they needed to change things. They did dabble in this space a little bit. You had ABAP Git, you've got Git from a cloud platform perspective. They started playing with integrating with other Git environments, but they weren't really right into that in a very heavy way. Around about 2020, SAP then pivoted. And they made a very conscious decision that they were going to become a cloud-first company. They were going to become a SaaS-based company. And as a result, we've seen things like Rise come out of that. We've got Grow come out of that. We relabeled Cloud Platform to BTP. And that's changed the way that you have to think about how you handle SAP, how you deal with change management, and the considerations of SAP in your landscape. So when we talk about what that looks like, we like to use this kind of a picture to describe the changes from an old SAP or your ECC, what a lot of people are still existing with today, towards what a modern architecture is going to look like. So if you think about ECC, your on-premise environments now, lots of customization, you've got lots of technical debt, it can be very difficult to make changes in your environment. And when you start thinking about it from a Rubik's Cube point of view, you make one change and then you have cascading effects. You've got to then chase down what other things is that actually impacting in your environment and how do you actually address those changes. And it becomes a little bit like a whack-a-mole, right, where you're trying to find where those changes are and make sure you're not going to break something else in your environment. Where SAP is going towards is a more modern architecture. It's service-based, it's event-driven architecture. It's a lot more nimble in the way that it needs to work. So what does that actually mean from a modern enterprise point of view? This is really talking about microservices, and microservices are about layers of abstraction. When you actually start to apply the right layers of abstraction to your environment, you can make things a lot easier. You can start to provide a lot more value to your end users in that particular manner. But where you need to understand how to actually handle those layers of abstraction, how to leverage that capability appropriately. And with that, you then reduce complexity for the end user, but that then introduces complexity from a development point of view. So you need to make sure you've got the right patterns in place, the way that you're actually leveraging those layers of abstraction, you understand how that works, and really lean into it. And that's why your event-driven architecture provides that value. And what do I mean by that from a layer of abstraction? So think about using GUI today. Everyone talks about how much they hate it. It's a clunky experience. You're moving towards Fiori. It's a better experience. Where we want to get to, or where we think it needs to get to, is the end user shouldn't actually really be consciously using SAP. They get some sort of a query comes into them, and they're using natural language processing to interact with something like Joule to say, I need this information, and it just comes back at them, and they continue to carry on with their work that they're doing. Their work shouldn't be just punching data into SAP, it should be executing on things. These layers of abstraction allow that to occur. So, when you think about that, what are the different lenses that we now need to think about with this new world, with a SaaS SAP environment, and these microservice event-driven based architectures? What does that look like? So these are the lenses that we like to think about from this, that we should all be thinking about from an architectural point of view. So from compliance, are we looking at things like compliance as code? How are we making sure when we move into these sorts of environments and we're going more SaaS and cloud native, how do you make sure you stay compliant with all of your government regulations? What are you doing about security? When you're going to SaaS, there's only so much hardening you can do around that particular environment. How do you make sure that you're protecting yourself, protecting the data that you've got out there, especially when you're starting to transfer that from one system to another? Architectural standards, what does that look like? What does your joint reference architectures look like? How are you making sure that you've got the right patterns in place, that you're adhering to those patterns across your organization? You think about architectural standards, it's like building a hammer, right? So you need to make sure that you've got a tool bag and you're building all the right hammers from an architectural standard point of view, and then everything starts to look like a nail for you. You just got to pick up the right hammer to hit that nail so you have the right patterns in place. Infrastructure. You've then got resilience and optimization. How are you thinking about those sorts of things? You don't have on-premise data centers anymore. You don't have necessarily the cloud that you can manage yourself. So how do you then think about DR? Are you then looking at multiple regions from a DR point of view? Are you thinking about something like BTP? How do you actually have redundancy there? How do you make sure you're leveraging the right capabilities? So maybe splitting some of your services across different regions, maybe having a mirror from one region to another region, having different partners in play. Like AWS is probably one of the core areas you want to think about here in regards to service availability. They've got the most services available from a BTP point of view. Is that the right path for you as you head down that particular track? From an optimization point of view, how are you sizing things? Have you got the right amount of compute? Have you got the right amount of storage? You don't want to load up too much because it's going to cost you too much, but you don't want to undersize it. So it's about how are we thinking about these things? How are we making sure we're governing it? And then automation. Trying to make this stuff as easy as possible. Infrastructure as a code is the goal we should all be heading towards if we're not already there. Being able to push a button, spin up a system that you require, spin up containers, Kubernetes environments, clusters, whatever that needs to look like to be able to do what you need to do, and then shutting it back down when it's no longer required. This is the new world that we're working in, and this is the new lenses we need to start thinking about from an SAP point of view. It is a brave new world for us, right? So what is the tool set starting to look like to help provide some visibility around this governance? This is where SAP is starting to form a bit of that tool set. The image in the front here, DevOps image, most of us should be aware of it. What we're really trying to call out here is change is the new norm, right? You think about when we move towards clean core, you're now in the cloud, SAP's rolling out updates on a continual basis, whether that be through to your S4 environment, whether that be to your BTP environment, change is happening all of the time, and we need to think about how we govern it, how we look after that stuff, and make sure it's all working the way it needs to. So the tool set at the top is going to help provide some of that capability, provide that the various lenses from a strategical and a tactical point of view. Now I'm going to just unpack that a little bit further. So LeanIX and Signavio are really the strategical lens of how we need to think about these sorts of things. Cool tools, they're becoming much more mature. A couple of years ago I wouldn't have really thought LeanIX is right for SAP yet. Now I think it's getting to the place where it needs to be. So when you boil it down, what are these tools really about? They're really about helping you map out your current state, what your current processes look like, and what your current architecture looks like. And then mapping out what your future state needs to look like. How do you marry your applications and your processes against business outcomes? What does that need to look like? And then helping you start to understand what that journey is going to look like. How big is that journey going to be? What's the change management going to be for you? But there's a lot of nuance in these sorts of things, right? There's two ways you can start to approach some of these changes. You've got the technical lens, so you're rationalizing away a product. You've got deprecated functionality and you need to migrate to something else. You've got upgrades that you need to apply. So that's your technical lens. Then you think about it from a functional lens. You might have a new LOB solution that needs to come in. You might have some automation that someone needs for a process improvement. improvement. You might have business requirements coming into you. Regardless of how you look at it from these different lenses, you need to make sure you're considering the change management of what's happening in your environment. So the functional architect, your technical architects, your enterprise architects, these people need to all start coming together and start to collaborate in regards to how these systems are working together, and making sure when changes are being enacted in the environment that your functional and your technical architecture is being updated to make sure that you're doing the right thing and thinking about all of that change management. And when you get that stuff working well and you get it working and right, that's when you start to light up opportunities for innovation. That's when you start seeing things like Signavio coming into play and going, here's an automation, here's how you can improve that particular process, here's how you can actually get rid of that redundancy in your environment and redeploy people towards something that's more value add. You start looking at some of the visionary stuff that SAP is putting out there around, you can start looking at a process and going, what's happening in this process, here's a way to improve that process. You can then get a partner solution to plug into it, click, 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 and in about half an hour to an hour, you've actually implemented a solution that can then be tested and move through the environment. This is the new world we're heading towards, and we need to be able to embrace that appropriately. So that's the strategical lens that you're looking at there. Now we start thinking about it from more of a tactical lens. How do you start addressing some of this stuff now? So telemetry should be treated as a first-class citizen in a cloud environment. This is how we should all start thinking about how we're collecting this data and what we're doing with that data. So ALM as a central observability platform is critical. You need somewhere as a central landing place to start gathering all this information, understanding what's happening in your environment, where have you got issues, how do you self-serve, how do you solve some of these problems. ALM we view is that central point to that tool set, right? And then you start thinking about process insights, making sure that people are adhering to your processes, making sure that you're adhering to best practices. Where do you have deviations? How do you then address those deviations in your environment? How do you make sure you're incentivizing the right behaviors and using more of the carrot, maybe a little bit less of the stick, but sometimes the stick is good as well, right? And then event-driven architecture. This is where we're heading towards, because that really enables that telemetry. When you start putting more things through an event-based integration, then you can start to measure performance against these sorts of things. And we should all be starting to lean into this kind of a paradigm from an event-driven architecture to enable that telemetry. And now from a functional lens. User experience. This is where things like WorkZone come into play. What does that look like for an end user from an end-to-end point of view? Are they opening up 17 different screens to try and do one business process? Because if they are, that's not a great user experience. So we need to think about how we're starting to map those things out. What's the user journey look like from an end-to-end point of view? And then business processes. How are we capturing KPIs? What are we doing in that particular manner? Are we displaying that on a work zone? Are we using BPA and then actually capturing some of those things and using process insights to then elevate where the things are working, where they're not working, where you've got bottlenecks within your environment? And then your customer journey or your end user journey. How are you thinking about that? That's where I see WalkMe is going to come into play and start actually adding some value, where you've got that on-screen assistance for users to start helping them move through that process and understanding where you've got sticking points, and then providing some of that AI capability to go, here's what other people have been doing, this is what you need to do, you need to fill out these fields, this is the sort of information. That's where something like WalkMe comes into play. So with all of that, you now need to start thinking about operations. How do you manage all that? How do you make sure that you've got the right things going on? The three main buckets on this screen are really FinOps, SecOps, DevOps. So DevOps is change as always, right? We're going to continually have these sorts of changes going in. How are you addressing that? What's in your pipeline or your tool chains? This is a really new concept for SAP customers. Think about traditionally, you'd cut code in ABAP in your core system and you move it through in a transport. Soulman will handle dependencies and overlaps and those sorts of things, but that's about as complicated as it gets. You might do a little bit of custom coding to make sure people adhere to your standards, but we haven't typically done too much more. In the newer environments, we need to think about how we're doing test-driven development to actually start making sure we've got robust code. How are we doing linting? What else are we putting in there? Are we doing security practices across the top of this stuff as well? That's where your DevOps pipelines need to come into play. And then once you've started to do changes in your environment, what's that do to your security apparatus? What does that look like for you? So you need to think about how you've got the right security systems in place, you've got the right SIEM systems in place. Are you doing penetration testing on the fly as part of your pipelines? That's something to consider. And then FinOps. obviously is really, really critical in this space as well. When you start to spin up new services, that's from a consumption perspective, that's going to start costing you more. How are you controlling that? How are you making sure that somebody isn't consuming all of your credits in the background without you even realizing it? And then once you actually go to turn on a service in BTP, suddenly you've got no more credits available to you because somebody else has consumed them. Think about that from a citizen developer perspective. You've got a lot more people playing in the environment who may not have the same governance or controls in place that they had previously. These sorts of tools are going to help you. And then when you look at things like AI ops, DevOps, data ops, cloud ops, they're all things that are starting to bubble up and becoming realistic, and we need to start thinking about how we address those. So there's a lot of different lenses that we need to consider in the newer world from an SAP point of view. So it's a lot of information I've just covered off in a very, very brief period of time. So some clear takeaways for you and things to think about. SAP is a SaaS company. That's where they are now. It's a different world to where we were 10 years ago. How have you changed your thinking about governing the modern landscape? What does that look like for you? How are you leaning into that increased pace of change that SAP is rolling out to us? What's your tool set to handle these sorts of things and supporting your business in that evolution? And what controls have you got in place for your ops? These are the sorts of things that I think we should all be thinking about and starting to put some answers in place or planning around how we're going to strategize around solving this. Thanks. Any questions? No, thank you. If you want to talk to me, then we've got a booth downstairs, so you can come and have a chat with us down there at any time. Thanks.